short review of the book is chock full of great ideas and observations, and all in only 200 pages, which I think is a real tribute to you. Too many books are too long. This book, what's nice about it, is you can read it between the flight from New York to San Francisco. So that's a real plus, right? Let's start by getting some audience survey here. So how many of you are here because you're interested in the effective operation of nonprofits? Okay, most of you. How many are here because you're interested in how to be a better donor to supporting nonprofits? And how many of you are here for the free food and drink? Okay, good. I knew there were some students, they probably are still out there getting them. Now, since a lot of you have been involved in the operation of nonprofits or supported them, how many of you think there's a lot of dysfunctionality in the nonprofit sector? Well, a fair number. How many of you think there's a lot of donor dissatisfaction with the operation of the nonprofits? Even if they support them, they maybe aren't happy with them. Yeah, there is a lot of that. Well, those are some of the topics we're going to talk about, and how to eliminate some of that donor dissatisfaction and that lack of functionality. So let me start, Kim, by asking you, why a book about nonprofits now? Why is this the moment that you and Bill chose to write a book?
Well, it all started in 2005 when I was overseeing the Kravis Prize for Nonprofit Leadership and encountered an extraordinary social entrepreneur named Roy Prosterman. And he was our inaugural prize recipient. And extraordinary guy. He's now 82 years old and he works every day to alleviate extreme poverty. I spoke to him a few weeks ago and he was heading out to Asia where he was going to do field work in the rural areas. And you know, it was encountering this organization that had developed a very compelling way to alleviate extreme poverty. It's in the form of land rights for people that otherwise wouldn't own the land but would work on it, and it shows to be a critical mechanism for alleviating poverty. But what was astonishing is that over time, they had reached and impacted over 100 million families, which is 400 million people. And at first glance, you would say, oh, well, they probably had a huge budget. But in fact, over the first 20 years, they were operating on a shoestring. They had $2 million a year budget. They operated out of this small one-bedroom apartment in Seattle. And it was so small, and the staff came to work there, and it was so small that they kept the files, half of them they kept in the bathtub, and the other half they kept on the stove of this apartment. I mean, that is shoestring, right? The glory days of shoestring. And so that started these questions of, okay, if it's not budget or size of organization, what are the factors that create extraordinary impact? And then as we started accumulating prize recipients, Bill and I did these convenings where we would have these peer learning retreats. And we'd bring all these prize recipients in for these day-long sessions and close the door to outsiders so they could speak freely. And we would ask them, tell us about your successes, your challenges, share them with others, what have you learned? And what was astonishing is that there was tremendous similarity in their experiences and the things that drove their impact. Even though these organizations worked in totally different sectors and different corners of the world, it was education and health and all of these different things, but there was similarity. And so that struck us and ultimately was the impetus to writing the book. For both Bill and I, we started this process about 3 years ago, and at the same time, for that experience, there was, as we looked overall at the sector, there was this particular moment that we believe in time that we call, now we are on the edge of the impact era, and I'll let Bill talk more about that. But it was the combination of all of those factors that led to it.
So Bill, talk about that. I mean, you've been teaching nonprofit management for a long time in the business school.
19 years.
19 years. So you chose Now, most professors who teach for 19 years decide to write a book before the 19 years is up, Bill. You waited 19 years. Was it that this was a moment for the sector that was particularly important? What motivated you?
I do think it is, and I think most of us are familiar with what's going on. Leave aside even these millennials. You know, as we baby boomers begin to glimpse the great white light in the lessening distance, we're going to be part of the largest intergenerational wealth transfer, certainly in the history of the United States. And we have the Giving Pledge and other such things. And this is before we even get to, you know, the 30-year-old billionaires. And at the same time, a whole series of things in nonprofits. The pressures on earned revenue are severe. I don't think there's going to be hardly any growth there. The pressures on government fees or grants, similarly. And so in almost any sector of the nonprofit economy, I think we can demonstrate that we're going to need more philanthropy. And as with a company or anything else, the nonprofits are going to have to be able to demonstrate that they've earned the right to receive more philanthropy. And they're going to have to be able to do it in a way that we don't think donors have demanded in the past.
So speak for a second about the earned revenue thing, because this is probably a concept that's not, and the trends are probably not, most people are probably not familiar with it. But whether you pick a university or a symphony, speak about it for a minute.
So let's say 20 years ago, I was chair of the board of GuideStar, which was founded by a classmate of mine, Buzz Schmidt. And it was one of the 3 nonprofit startups that survived the first internet era. Network for Good, Volunteer Match, and GuideStar. And the man who funded these organizations was a guy named Joel Fleischman, who at the time ran the Atlantic Philanthropies. And he was basically said, listen, I put together a syndicate. We're going to give you $12 or $15 million if you can go through our due diligence and meet our needs. And then he said one thing: we expect you to be more sustainable. And I said, Joel, let's just agree that you don't know any more about what that means than I do. But that, about 20 years ago was when nonprofits were told to be more sustainable.
Right.
And that means basically earned revenue, meaning ticket revenue, tuition, something that people pay for a product or service just like they do in a business. And so we can go sector by sector. If you're a classical music lover, if you're setting tuition for Stanford University, a whole range of nonprofits, hospitals, the chances that you're going to be able to raise your earned revenue above inflation for the next 20 years, we think is very minimal. So that's cut off. And I think that's the major problem. I mean, you look at performing arts organizations, and almost all of them have raised their tickets too far, and now they're thinking about cutting the ticket prices to have more people there, which is great, except more people at lower prices is probably lower earned revenue. And if your mission is to create a forum for great dance or great visual art or great music, you're supposed to be open to as many people as possible. And so I think that's going to put downward pressure there too. And I think, as well, you know better than us, gross tuition for these universities have already been under great pressure.
Right.
And I don't think either gross tuition or net tuition are going to be growing in the next 20 years like they have.
Right. The gap is getting bigger just as it is for museums and performing arts organizations and things. I agree with you. I think it's really happening. So Kim, talk a little bit about, you mentioned global poverty, clearly a big issue, a critical issue. Where are other areas where you see nonprofits really making a dent in a problem that perhaps government hasn't solved, really, has not been able to make any progress on?
Well, certainly in extreme poverty alleviation.
Yeah, that's a clear one.
At King Philanthropies, we have started a new initiative recently that's focused on malnutrition, which, it's interesting how we got there, because we started with this blank page and said, okay, where in the field of extreme poverty could we make the most difference or the most impact? And we looked at a whole lot of interventions, and malnutrition bubbled up, not least because there are interventions that are high impact and low cost that actually work, but also because it's something that most donors have neglected. 45% of deaths of children under 5 are due to malnutrition-related causes, and yet something like 1% of donor funding is actually addressing that. So there was this huge disconnect and this opportunity for us to make a difference. And I think the other thing that we're doing that is particularly, perhaps unusual, but certainly important, is funding organizations that have already demonstrated a clear evidence base that the intervention works. So, while there's certainly a place for innovation, at the same time, increasingly, there are things that work, and it is worth funding them.
Yeah. So, Bill, closely connected to the point that Kim just made is this whole issue of mission and what's the mission of the nonprofit, and to what extent do nonprofits have mission creep, which is much larger. You make a big point of this in the book. I mean, essentially, a whole chapter is devoted to this subject. So talk about why you see it as so important for nonprofits and why it's a problem compared to, let's say, the for-profit sector.
Well, so I'll just put it in simple terms. Nonprofits are definitionally mission-driven organizations. They're mission-driven organizations. We know public corporations or businesses are shareholder value-driven or profit-driven or cash-driven. Nonprofits are mission-driven. Essentially, everybody before us has said, oh, it doesn't really need to have a mission. The mission doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't have to have a statement. And we're trying to put a stop to that. Why doesn't it have to be clear and focused is our simplest 2 criteria. And it should start with that. And if you've I do a class every year, so this will be the 20th year. I'll say 60 students bring in mission statements, and they read them out loud, and 3/4 of them, you can't even tell what the organization does. The typical thing is, let's say, to solve world poverty 1 life at a time. And it's a food bank in 1 county. And in the sector, there's this belief that vague is inspirational. And also, we have foundations, for sure, and some individual funders who fund projects. Unlike King Philanthropies, we fund organizations with proven interventions. Well, what happens is you got a vague, broad mission statement. You have a foundation who's giving you out a $1 million grant for something it's not really what we kind of do, and we use cigar box accounting, so no one's ever going to really know, but we creep. We just adjust that because we're going to do midnight basketball as well as, food in the schools because somehow they're related. And so we're just trying to put a stick on the ground. What's your mission? Is it clear? Is it focused? The last thing I'll say about mission and focus, and it goes into the strategy issue. 2 or 3 places in the book we have to argue with analogy. There is no dependent variable for nonprofits, certainly not one you can use cross sectors. But we do know that if there's one very well settled tenet of corporate strategy is that focus beats diversification. And so our point is very simple. If it's true for a company, why should a $500,000 nonprofit have 3 focuses? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. So.
But this is many nonprofits I see, Kim, when they get under revenue pressure, diversification is what they do.
Absolutely.
Rather than double down, they diversify.
Right.
I'll get more revenue by doing something else, right?
Right.
And even our museums and things do that. In addition to selling tickets, I'll open my facility at night for people to use for private parties, and maybe I'll make a lot of money doing that. I mean,
Right. And you can see how they get there. But the problem is they can't really, in the long run, be as effective. And if you think about in the private sector, if there was a bakery that suddenly decided that they wanted to develop software and make pianos and make tennis rackets, there would be eyebrows raised. And yet the equivalent happens in the nonprofit sector, and nobody blinks, not the donors, not the staff, not the management team. And so, we did this interesting survey recently, and we just released results, but one of the things that was so interesting is we asked nonprofit organizations, how focused or diversified is your organization? And about 37% said that they were diversified. And then we asked them, how focused do you think your organization's activities should be focused or diversified? And more than a quarter of them said diversified. So there's still, there's mixed opinions about this, and our perspective
and
is not.
So, Kim and I have been talking about what some call the social capital markets for 25 years, because in the nonprofit sector, when the going gets tough, you invent a new phrase. It's the Tower of Babel, right? And our phrase has gone where most of them have gone. Any of you who've ever written, you realize that whenever you read a book about writing, the metaphors are always violent, right? I mean, they just talk about open up your wrists and bleed. And one of the tenets you'll read about editing is, I think someone put it, the first thing you do is kill all your little darlings, So what you're supposed to do is take out the sections you love the most. Well, the chapter that we had to take out in response to editorial comment was called Donor Power. If you look at the best market research, which is not very good, less than 10% of donors, even major philanthropists, do any evaluation before they make a gift. Any.
Less than 10%?
Less than 10%.
And the question was...
Are we talking about big gifts as well as little gifts?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. And so what does not exist now is donors and board members basically don't speak up. And so if they diversify, so many of us board members, I mean, it's the strangest thing. You take all these really intelligent, accomplished people, you block them in a room of a nonprofit board, and all of a sudden, they don't have confident insight anymore. And, because the social workers or the nurses or the teachers or the academics somehow have convinced them that their secret sauce is beyond the comment of an intelligent layman.
Exactly.
And that's kind of a, those of you who are executive directors who work for a nonprofit know that your incentives to be completely open with your board, they can sometimes be mixed. And so there is no force as of now, unless there's a good board, to turn to the nonprofit leader and say, no, you're not going to do that.
Yeah. But what surprises me about this is most nonprofits do not have a surplus of management talent. If anything, they have a shortage of management and leadership talent, right? If you diversify, you're just taking your talent and spreading it thinner.
For sure.
So it's a bad idea.
For sure. But again, if you're not measured, if nobody asks the tough questions, one of the things that Collins points out in his foreword, which is, most nonprofits are very small. In the U.S., 75% of nonprofits are $100,000 or less.
Right.
And yet they will diversify versus just simply say, well, I guess we have to go back to try to raise more money for this very unresolved problem that we're committed to working for.
So you would think if the nonprofit was well managed and it was in this dilemma, that one option would be put itself out of existence.
Yeah.
At some point, that's the right choice, right? But I don't think it happens. If I look at the 501c3 listing, it just keeps getting longer and longer and longer.
So when you ask people about why they have a broad mission, they say, well, what happens if this disease gets cured?
You declare victory.
Yeah, that's right. And how many diseases really get cured?
Yeah.
We could tell a story about the Pediatric AIDS Foundation, which had the same issue, and I'll allow Phil and Charles to tell you that they didn't sunset it. After pediatric AIDS in the U.S., it basically became not a big issue. The incentives are
But
just
some
not
big
there.
foundations do spend out sometimes. Not so much the nonprofits.
Yeah, and this is going to be the big issue.
Philanthropies.
On our website, engineofimpact.org, we have a payout model.
Okay, interesting.
And you can put in various numbers for your billions. And one of the things it shows, I'd never actually done the arithmetic, is you get out to about 25, 30 years, and it's a pretty flat curve. You might as well be perpetual.
Flat. Once you get out to 20 years,
Right?
you're essentially an endowment.
And we have, it's very common now, and it's true for me, by the way, I'm giving away all my wealth in the lifetime of my grandchildren. Well, at that point, you might as well be perpetual, if you want.
You effectively are.
You
if
effectively
you say the
are,
lifetime of your grandchildren, right? You effectively are.
Just to speak a little bit about the arithmetic in the introduction to the book, we did some fun with numbers. And we dimensionalized this need for philanthropy to be about 100 to 300 billion more than a base case in 2025. And most of you know that U.S. philanthropy is about 400 billion. Mm-hmm. Probably a third of that is churches. Mm-hmm. Total revenue for the sector is about 2 trillion. Most of us don't realize, but think about it. Think about every hospital around here. Right. 75% of the hospital beds in the U.S. are nonprofit. Right. That's a choice that we've made that's different than virtually any company. But if you look out, and let's just pick a plausible scenario. I was reading the papers today, and some great financial economist, was saying he thinks real rates of return are going to be 2 to 3% for the next 20 years. Right. Well, if you have a foundation with a required 5% payout, or a university who's living off a 5.5% payout, that's going to be difficult. Yep.
2 to 3% real return will be difficult for
Somebody
lots of people.
says that, and who knows? I don't know, but that's not a rare kind of prediction.
Yeah.
And so, we're living what I think, in retrospect, we'll be viewing as the peak for the robustness of revenues of all kinds for the nonprofit sector. Yeah. And we're going to need every dollar that we can get from Giving Pledge people and everybody else. We also call in the book not to give away 50%. We think that if you've got $1 billion or more, you can give away 90% and your kids will still be fine.
They'll be fine, as long as we still have the wisdom to have an estate tax.
Yes.
So Kim, talk about one of the things that derives directly, I think, from this issue of focus on mission is the whole issue of strategy and ensuring the nonprofit has a strategy. So talk about why you see that as so important and what you think of what's the key thing, what are the 2 or 3 things that every nonprofit should do with respect to strategy?
So we think that many of the concepts from business strategy are actually applicable to the nonprofit sector. So we have a chapter on strategy that we say is the few strategic concepts that matter. Mm-hmm. One of them is this notion of core competency. There was a seminal HBR article many years ago, I think it was 1990, for Holland and Hamill, and the notion was basically that an organization's strategy must be a function of its core competency and its skill or distinctive skill or skills. And it is astonishing how many nonprofits out there is a mismatch between their skills and what they're aspiring to do. So that is very, very important. Theory of change as well, which is a nonprofit concept, equally important, and we have a whole discussion of that in the book. Strategic planning processes, we argue that, in fact, the process is as important as the end product, especially in the nonprofit sector. It's about engaging stakeholders, and that means it takes a lot of time and a lot of energy, but it almost always pays off in the end.
And a couple of basics. We say, listen, every nonprofit competes in a market. It could be a market defined by market failure, like Eastside Prep, which many of you know. Mm-hmm. When it opened, there were no such things as charter schools, mm-hmm. and there was no high school of any kind in East Palo Alto. East Palo Alto. On the other side, not to bring up a sore point, but I've taught the Stanford UCSF case for many years. Mm-hmm. Well, Stanford UCSF net, operated in a market. It was hoped for to be dominantly the tertiary quaternary market, though Stanford certainly, and they both had a lot of primary. And in the end, what they were really trying to do was provide an entity to fix price. And then over time, perhaps build some research and cost synergies. That, again, is a kind of Porter analysis, or in nonprofits, it's called the Oster analysis, that would be very much the same as if they were both businesses.
Right.
Yeah, let me try to put all this mission strategy stuff in context. You know, our book, I think, is at some levels going to be called both fundamental and controversial, or even vapid and controversial, because the core message is clear and focused mission, a strategy based on a theory of change to achieve that mission, and some data to show that it works.
Yeah.
People go, well, we're already doing that. And you say, could you show me? And they go, I'll get back to you. So those are just basic things, and most of us write checks, and most of us sit on boards without ever really asking those simple 3 or 4 questions. And you know, the standard response is measurement is too expensive.
Yeah, so let's talk about the measurement issue, because I think this is a critical issue, and you make a very strong point of measure, and by strong preference, measure quantitatively, not qualitative measures. So Kim, why do you think, I mean, I agree, lots of nonprofits don't hold themselves accountable. Why do you think it's going to be so important if we're going to see this sector really thrive?
For a number of reasons. You know, big picture, the social capital market that Bill mentioned, you know, which is basically the funding flows in the sector. Right now, it's very messed up, right? On the one hand, you have great organizations that are really well managed that struggle to raise enough money. On the other hand, you have organizations that have some fatal flaw in their organization or aren't managed particularly well, and yet they raise a lot of money, often because there's a charismatic founder or whatnot. But increasingly, you know, our hope is that donors get more sophisticated and start allocating their resources towards the highest performing organizations. Well, in order to identify those organizations, you need data about whether or not the intervention works. There's, you know, the vast majority of organizations don't have compelling evidence that the intervention works. So, you know, and there's a resistance in the sector. Often it's, but you know, our intervention, it's so qualitative, you can't reduce it to numbers. And our perspective is it's worth trying. And we give an example in the book of Willow Creek Community Church, which undertook this process. It was a Stanford GSB alum who was working there, and he undertook this process to translate qualitative factors, something as touchy-feely as spiritual growth, to translate that into quantitative dimensions so that they could learn something. And in fact, the process enabled them to learn something and had them completely change their programmatic model as a response to what they learned from the numbers.
Yeah, and as a result, they were very activity-based, and the market research insight was, in fact, it wasn't that going to church was better, or being in more covenant groups or more volunteers. It was private Bible reading. Who knew?
Yeah.
And just to expand on that, one of the reasons we had this case written was to make 2 points. Number one, here's a tough measurement problem. Secondly, if we can measure what seems to correlate with one's self-reported journey on the path to a personal relationship, my guess is there's a lot of other things.
There are a lot of things we can measure.
And, you know, we call ourselves in the book analytics who love Yates. And, you know, after 30 years at McKinsey, I mean, listen, the first line of defense is we can't measure that.
Right.
And there's you know, faculty research quality. Are the polls, the National Research Council things, were they pretty good?
They're okay.
Yeah.
I mean, they're, you know, I think the answer to this is that an approximate measurement is a whole lot better than no measurement.
Absolutely.
Always, right?
Right.
So, you know, are they perfect in terms of evaluating the quality of faculty input, productivity index? They're not perfect. But are they a pretty good measure?
Right.
If you just say, okay, the top third is clearly better than the next third is clearly, yes, they're fine. They're fine. So talk about one of the challenges I think for some nonprofits is they're trying to operate on a long time scale.
Right.
So how do they deal with this measurement issue when you're trying an intervention that may take a decade?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that have gone on. First of all, if you look at poverty, my characterization is development economists looked at macro-regression occasions of growth and economic development. After 20 years, they concluded that they didn't know. Every country was different. And so JPAL at MIT, the economics department, basically turned it on its head. And now the notion of a random controlled trial for social intervention is now the platinum plate. And yes, if you want to know 20-year impact, you got to wait 20 years. But it turns out that after a while, you can find out that the data after 3 or 4 years correlates pretty long with the longer term.
Right. So you get intermediate milestones.
You get intermediate milestones that. And secondly, we're no fans of venture philanthropy, and don't ask us about impact investing. But venture philanthropy was, around the late 90s. The last time Silicon Valley was, everything. Yes, right. And it turned out to be a metaphor for venture capitalists and entrepreneurs to consider how they might affect the sector. But the model was flawed. Venture capital investments, by and large, have a 5 to 7 year time frame, maybe 10. The notion was, I'm going to give you my smarts, my money, and I'm going to monitor you like a venture-backed company. Well, as you say, if it takes 15 to 20 years, how do you know? My first mentor as an adult in 1974, I had dinner with him last night, Bill Drayton, in about the 1980s. He started an organization about Ashoka, which, and widely credited with launching the movement we now call social entrepreneurship. Nobody knew whether it was doing anything for 15 years. Similar with Roy Prosterman.
Right.
And so it's a different time frame, and if you're trying to have long-run impact, yes, you have to look for intermediate milestones. There are some things which might be largely qualitative, but again, that doesn't mean there aren't some good quantitative milestones you can ask about along the way.
And one other thing to add on this timing point is I think donors typically, there's this perverse practice in the sector of making one-year grants.
Yeah.
And so consequently, organizations, they can't plan ahead and they can't actually build the capacity that they need to scale. And it's very hard to do evaluations over the long run because they can't count on the funding coming. So to the extent that donors start becoming more enlightened and funding over multiple years and being willing to fund operating expenses and not just the sexy program stuff, but the evaluations, I think the sector really can make a significant transformation.
So really there's no current way to do this. So there are a set of organizations that I support every single year, right? They're programmed in, the money goes directly from my donor advised fund every single year. And unless they screw up and do something really bad,
and I was with you earlier today, and in 1 hour you used the word data 12 times.
Yeah.
How much data do you have on that portfolio of?
Well, some of them are organizations well. I do have some data on them. I know something about at least their operating expenses, what percentage of their dollars actually go to the end purpose you care about, right?
Yeah, yeah. Which are, of course, measures you would love to have applied to the Stanford University.
Sure, no problem. No problem. We'd be happy to have those.
Because we're low expense.
We know those numbers, right? So. But let me, one thing I do worry about is I worry about a little bit of focus on sort of highly measurable metrics, as for example, we'd have on Give Directly, a charity you're associated with that I support, I believe in what they do. But that's an easy charity to measure, right? Because Give Directly, the money goes directly to people and directly to them to spend immediately, right? As opposed to, I'm the charity that's going to build schools in Africa and educate women, educate young girls, and that's obviously a longer haul. Do you worry that those two, they can't be compared on the same set of metrics.
No.
So then do you drive to the one which has simple metrics to measure?
Well, I think, like investments, I think any significant philanthropist should think about it as a portfolio,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And, my own base case portfolio is, let's say, 2/3 of your money should go to things that you care about, that you have basis to believe are having impact, right? What King Philanthropies is doing for poverty is, in fact, revolutionary.
Yep.
Everybody wants to do something new and different, despite the fact that we've only just come to understand that giving a tenant farmer private property for their land, giving them cash, and a couple of other things actually moves people out of extreme poverty. We didn't know that 25 years ago. Let's contrast it with education. Let's just be prepared to say that having enough schools per capita in Africa is on its face a good thing. Then we get to our country. And not to be controversial, but all the things that have been shown and proven to change the outcomes of U.S. K through 12 public education are
Parental involvement.
Yes, but that's, again, that's assuming away the can
Actually,
opener.
I think we're going to figure this problem out, whether or not we have the will to change to align our schools with. Teacher quality we know makes a difference.
Yes.
It's hard to measure, but we know
Right.
it makes a difference, right?
Right.
So two things
But my
make a
point
difference.
is,
Lots of things don't.
so let's pick
Small schools don't, right?
Okay, so it
parental
took Bill
income.
Gates. It took Bill Gates, who's done terrific work on global health, but
Yeah.
it took him $1 billion
It did take them a lot of money.
to find out that class size doesn't matter.
Class size, small schools don't matter.
Right.
Great
And so
teacher
my
trumps
point
class
is
size.
an enormous amount of money is being spent today
I know.
against things that, if you just talk to one education professor, you would find out that it's long since proven not to have an impact.
Well, everybody jumped on the small schools, small class size movement
For example.
without the data, right? So it's.
But I'm trying to make a larger point too, which is there are very significant subsectors of nonprofits that do not have a theory of change that has been demonstrated even at the early stage to work. And yet, often because they're social services or they're for people that we care about, we will continue to fund them without really asking for, and for me, you can argue about it all the time, but give me reading scores and math scores.
No. So Kim, let's talk about the issue of scaling, because I think in my experience, after getting a nonprofit started, the next hardest problem is scaling, if it makes sense for that. Talk about, it's one of the great diagrams in your book, you have this model of the challenges for scaling nonprofits. Talk some about how you see that scaling problem.
So if a Martian came down and looked at the nonprofit sector, he would be completely perplexed, especially, for example, on this topic of scaling, right? On the one hand, there's economies of scale that exist in the nonprofit sector, and everybody's talking about scaling, and it's a hot topic, and yet most organizations are tiny and subscale, and many of them have not, as we say, earned the right to scale their impact. And so we used some of the framework from the book, what we believe are the 7 elements of an effective organization. And we used those to filter organizations. As I said, we had done this survey, and we used all the data and tried to classify organizations into where they would fall on this matrix that John is talking about. Because we made the assumption that first, you have to get your strategic thinking in place. That is your mission, your strategy, and your impact evaluation. And you have to be strong at that before you can earn the right to scale. And then, in addition, then you need the fuel, so to speak. After you get your engine, which is these elements, you need the fuel: governance, funding, your talent, and your organization. And we had these as the 2 axes. And then we placed different organizations. And what was interesting is that There were so many organizations in what we call scale jail, which means they...
What was that? It was about 30?
Yeah, scale jail. That was a great...
And there were so many in scale jail, and that's because they didn't have the basics in place, their mission, their strategy, or their impact evaluation. And we did have a category that we called small is beautiful, and those are organizations that are functioning well, but for whatever reason, they're community organizations that want to be small. And the classic example is Eastside Prep.
Right.
Chris doesn't have aspirations to scale and franchise, but it is a wonderful...
And if it scaled, it might break.
Right, but it is working and it is effective and it is serving a very significant unmet need in East Palo Alto.
Yep.
Great, small is beautiful. And then we have, some other quadrants in the matrix. One of them is Field of Dreams, we call it. Build it and they will come. And the notion there is that they do have these basics in place, mission, strategy.
Right. That's about 15%.
Yeah, and they have...
So we think 15% of nonprofits have a case to scale and need to grow. The rest of them, my favorite, as Kim knows, we used one of those Escher diagrams.
Yeah, waterfall.
Perpetual,
the famous waterfall.
Yeah, the Penrose triangle. And I suspect everybody in the Stanford community has gotten this. An extremely energetic, articulate, young social entrepreneur. And you're just captivated. You've written the check before he or she talks. And then they tell you what they're going to do. And you go to yourself, And one of the in the nonprofit sector, we're very polite. We never mention any names.
You only mention nonprofits you admire, not the ones.
Yeah, that's right. But at any point in time, there's 3 or 4 people, not necessarily Stanford students, but who, when they come out here in February when it's too cold in New York, and they're just everything seems right about them. Except that their chosen intervention, you just go, and forget about the data, the logic of it just doesn't seem that compelling. Mm-hmm. And we think that's about 15% too.
Oh, interesting.
Right?
Interesting.
And the other problem with scale is just go back to sources of funding.
Funding.
Listen, foundations tell nonprofits to focus, and they all have 4 or 5 program areas. They tell nonprofits they need to be more robustly funded, and they fund a program for 1 year without overhead. There is not a lot of money. In the last 10 years, Echoing Green, Stanford and other business schools, Draper Richards Kaplan, you can actually get a new nonprofit through about 5 years just through going through a set of gates that exist. But nobody is out there for 5 to 15 years, right? The intervention's probably not yet completely proven.
Right.
The organization has yet to scale.
Right. The foundations have done their thing. They don't want to see you darkening their door again.
That. And so again, Bob and Dottie are here. We're funding organizations. We're funding the organization to spend the money as they choose. We're giving them 3 years of money with some hope of being evergreen, which is to say if they meet their milestones, we'll continue to fund them. Now, doesn't that sound rational?
Yep.
Why would you, as many foundations do, walk away from a nonprofit that is having impact so that you can give it to somebody else? But that's the way it's done still today. Our great hope, probably my most common fact, the people who come to see me with the false hope that I am a gateway to money, is 75% of U.S. philanthropy is from individuals. Foundations, 12 to 15%. Corporations, people
Small.
always say, oh, let's go to the,
Small,
and I go,
people
guys,
have no idea.
And if you've
It's in the
ever
noise.
tried to raise money from a corporate foundation, it's just, wow.
And the
it's
money comes out of the marketing budget, so it's always got...
increasingly. And, now, in almost every case, there are some high net worth individuals, if you can find them, who will resonate with what you're doing and be much more flexible about the possibilities of funding
Sure.
if they see the impact over time.
Sure.
And we just know that from particularly out here.
Yeah. So let's talk about the issue of board governance, because you have devoted a chapter to this issue, and I think rightly so. Beginning with a critique of the quality, the scale, the organization of nonprofit boards. So if you were gonna tell somebody who was either serving as a board member or was setting up a nonprofit and was going to have a board, what are the few things you tell them about how that board governance should work?
My fundamental advice would be to ask questions. Keep asking questions, especially about these core, we come back to the core issues, right? Mission, what is our mission? Are we focused? Every board member could be the mission creep police for that organization, and yet often people are afraid of causing an embarrassing ruckus or whatnot by asking these questions. Similarly, making sure that there is a coherent strategy to achieve that mission. Again, impact evaluation, making sure that the organization is evaluating in a way that is coherent and compelling and makes sense.
So I would add at least two more things. Number one, particularly if you're the chair, but most of us don't do our homework for nonprofit board meetings.
Right.
And we don't show up prepared with the incisive questions. So many nonprofit boards of one sort or another, it's a network of which we want to be a part. Could be social, could be
status related.
Status, yeah. It could be, I'm really liberal, I hang around with, this kind of a group. And it does not foster direct, insistent, persistent questioning.
Yeah.
We just don't want to embarrass ourselves. We don't want to embarrass the staff. Very often the staff come from some other professional class. My gosh, you would never want to, push a doctor and ask, don't you understand? He's dedicated his life to that. And so you just have to prepare, and you have to actually understand what the nonprofit does, what the economics of it are. So that's one. The other one is something that very few of us like to do, which is if you want to be a very powerful, influential nonprofit board member, be prepared to ask people for money.
Yeah. Give or get, right? This is a rule for people on nonprofit boards. Give or get,
That's right? And
you
all probably don't know, at Stanford University, we value not only philanthropists, but people who are prepared to introduce the university to other philanthropists.
Absolutely, absolutely. So one of the things I've observed about nonprofit boards, if you're on a board of a public company and you miss more than 25% of the meetings, and I don't just mean the standing board meetings, I mean even telephonic meetings or things, that's a reportable event, and it goes in the proxy that you missed. I'll bet you the average nonprofit board has many more than 25% of the misses by various members of the board.
There's no way to know. But, listen, I'm not arguing for regulation. So this is a sector which, at a certain level, has flourished. There's nothing else like it in the world. If you cheat or lie or steal, there are state charity commissions that might stumble over that. And then there's the Form 990 that most people know about that instilled guide star that was sent on paper to the IRS that was put in boxes and shipped to a warehouse in Maryland. There's no, people for years would say, what's the implications of Sarbanes-Oxley for nonprofit boards? And this would be viewed as a very sophisticated question. And the short answer is, almost nothing.
You're not subject to Sarbanes-Oxley. You are subject to audit rules, right? And compensation rules,
yes,
right?
Yes. But again, we got over 1 million in the US, and somebody has to notice.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't happen very
one
often.
of the things that struck me about nonprofit boards, if you're on a board of a public company now, you must do board evaluation. It's required that the board evaluate itself.
Yeah.
Most nonprofit boards don't evaluate themselves. So they're not critiquing their own performance.
Well, so let's go to what they do instead, which is term limits.
Yeah, they do term limits.
And it varies by nonprofits, but I just stepped off the Symphony board after 27 years. Well, there are any number. It's a large board. It's like 85.
It is a large board.
And there are any number of people who've been very dedicated to the Symphony for 20 or 30 years. There's not a reason in the world to ask them off the board. The reason we have term limits for many nonprofits is that I really just don't want to sit down with Kim and tell her that
We can gracefully bring their, right.
people don't want to have those conversations.
Right.
They just don't.
Well, I mean, the flip side of that is I've seen some boards of universities that have perpetual membership.
Yes.
And you go into the boardroom and there are 20 guys over 80 sitting in the back of the boardroom actually opining on what the university should do. This is not a healthy thing, probably. So there's a balance. It's a balance here in figuring out.
No, it is. And my only point is better that you have a governance committee that actually does evaluate its members, say, at the end of their term, and be prepared to have the challenging conversation.
Yeah.
Again, the problem with universities is, I used to say at the Symphony Board, you don't really have to ask her after the board at 85.
Right.
And you're probably not referring to the Harvard Court Board or anything like that, but if you're a university with an 85-year-old, you're probably just going to leave it alone.
Right.
And that's probably not good for governance.
Right. Kim, do you want to make any closing remarks before we open the floor for questions?
I want to let everyone know that on our book website, we have developed this tool. It's called a Diagnostic Tool that if you are involved with any type of nonprofit organization, it's a list of questions. It takes about 10 minutes to complete, and it enables you to assess your organization's strengths and weaknesses on these 7 elements that we think are so important. And what can be useful is to have many stakeholders at your organization take the diagnostic and then to meet to discuss the results. Discuss where there's similarity in viewpoint, where there's differences in viewpoint, where the weaknesses are, and how you can all work to address them together. So it's engineofimpact.org. So I'll send you to our website, and we think the tool is quite helpful, and it will enable you to, the computer will plot or after you answer the questions, it'll plot your organization on the matrix so you can see where you are, whether you're in the waterfall or the scale jail or whatnot.
Okay, we have a microphone in the aisles, and Bill had a special request. He wanted me to give him only softballs so that all the hard questions could be asked by people in the audience. So
thank you, John.
Don't hold back. Let's start over here.
First of all, thank you, Kim and Bill, for your insights tonight. I'm Kevin Selwyn. I'm with the DCI program. And I have kind of a combination question, but I think you'll find that both of these scenarios are very likely. Number one is, I'm not the largest donor or even a very large donor to any nonprofit that I'm involved with, at least by the scale you're talking about. And number two, there's a lot of nonprofits that have metrics and they're measuring the wrong thing. So take a scenario of the food bank, for instance, in which what they're measuring is how many meals are we serving each year? And I believe they ought to be measuring how many people don't need our service anymore. Ditto for homelessness. It's not a question of how many people are put up, it's a question of how many people are we getting out of homelessness and into permanent housing. So I guess my question becomes, how can I, as a medium-sized donor to these organizations, get them to focus on measuring the right things?
So two or three things. First of all, who knows? There must be hundreds of food banks in the U.S. One of them measures it correctly, and you should just find out what they do. I would argue for something in the middle of what you described. The first one was simply an output measure. The other one was an outcome measure. The problem is that there are too many factors influencing hunger or homelessness that the food bank has no influence over. So I can't tell you what it would be off the top of my head, but it would be something in the middle. And, as per your own money and resources, I'm pretty sharp about this, which is if they're not doing what you think they should, take your money and time someplace else. There's a lot of opportunities for all of us to contribute, whether financially, time, or our leadership. And I think, if you don't get the right answers to the right questions, or if you don't feel your money is spent, you're the scarce resource, so is your money. And the thing you should do is to, find another food bank or find some other nonprofit Most nonprofits, if you just let them know you're interested and you write them a small check and you show up at a couple of functions, you'll be on the board in plenty of time.
That's assuming you
Especially if you have rich friends.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
John Massey.
Yeah, I'm John Massey. I have a couple different kinds of intersections with nonprofits, so I was really glad to hear all this. But I have a question, since you worried about funding. There's a funding thing that might come up going on right now in the House with getting rid of the Johnson Amendment and letting nonprofits do more political activity. And the sort of question for you to start thinking about while I fill this in is, is that good? Is that bad? Is that likely to what kind of consequences may that have? So to fill it in, I'm a trustee of the Computer History Museum, which fortunately has a pretty strong board and I think runs pretty well. But I also spend a lot of time, I'm one of the people that reads Form 990s. I mean, I have hundreds sitting on my laptop, which is pretty mind-numbing. And there's a set of 501c3s. They're pretty bad, but there's a set of 501c3s that some companies and foundations have used really to do political activity of one kind or another, right? And then, of course, there are some that have C3, C4 splits to keep that apart. But the question is, if this thing in the House comes to be that sort of says it's okay for C3s to do politics, there's likely to maybe be some funding flows that get attached to that. And if we're worried about funding flows, what do we do? So do you guys have any opinions on that? I know this is not like set law yet, and who knows whether it'll be.
Yeah, as you can imagine, this is a hard topic to contain the dialogue on, right? I think most of you already know 501c3s are typical nonprofits. There's very strict restrictions on them to be able to advocate, much less lobby. Right. Some of them test those limits. 501c4s, which include PACS, do not allow tax deductibility of your contributions, but they can lobby and do all sorts of stuff. This is just a personal opinion. Listen, nonprofits should do what they do, not advocate. The ones that do advocate, one of the trends in Silicon Valley philanthropy, we'll see whether it works out. They're less interested in funding nonprofits. They want to influence policy and politics. Wow, we'll know in 30 years whether that's a good idea. I'm not sure an operating nonprofit should take hardly any of that on. Now, I've fought a case on Planned Parenthood for 20 years. Well, Planned Parenthood does advocacy for two reasons. Number one, it's a contentious issue, and number two, people don't like giving money to clinics, they like giving money to advocacy. Kim, don't disagree with me.
Really? You think that's really true?
Oh, yeah. Like disease societies, they give money to the cure, not to helping the families and the patients.
Yeah.
It's very
Okay,
often,
that's a good point.
very
That's a
often the
good point.
case.
Interesting.
And so, listen, I haven't read all this stuff closely. There's a political agenda, which I think is transparent there. And, every once in a while, somebody calls for more federal regulation of 501c3s. Churches, abortion, whatever the issue. And in the end, it ain't perfect, but I think if we started to try to pick pieces apart, how about maybe 150 basis point taxes on elite university endowments?
Endowment incomes, right? Yeah, there's a good idea. So that means now the return rate I need is 1.4% higher to run the same operation.
Yeah.
Right?
We didn't have a time tonight to go into the unique American history. Nonprofits of this scale and importance in the economy, say 8 to 10%. It's unique to America. And with the exception of the Filer Commission, which was in the 70s, which was significantly about trying to get at foundations and their liberal agendas, there really hasn't been much oversight, call for new regulation or law. And I haven't heard a proposal I like better than leave it alone. But
Yeah, you'll probably break it if you mess around with it too much.
Well,
and
you
the
definitely
political
break part of it.
influences on breaking it will just mount and mount and mount.
You know,
right?
I mean, you know, we liberals say, why you let the tax deductibility to churches?
Right.
And there's a very significant portion of America which thinks that's the best idea.
Right. So,
Sure. So my name's Billy Delancey. It's funny I followed the question because I started a nonprofit that allows people to hire lobbyists. So yeah,
Say again, please.
I started a nonprofit that allows people to hire lobbyists. It's a crowdfunding platform.
to hire lobbyists.
So that, because I disagree, I think that if your mission is to impact change, you're going to have government policy programs to achieve that at scale. But actually, my question is not related to politics, but it was more for Kim about the global goals and how those statistics and measurements have impacted your giving statistics and measurements and what you measure, and how you've incorporated the global goals.
You mean the millennial goals, so-called?
Well, there were the millennial goals first.
Right.
Now there's sustainable development goals, but the term is global goals. So yes, the SDGs, and how that's impacted your giving strategy and your measurement strategy.
So, big picture, when we started this malnutrition program, we looked at a whole lot of challenges in the world and at potential solutions, as I said. And, we did our best to take a fact-based analysis to try to come up with what we saw as, as a foundation working in Silicon Valley, where can we have the most impact? Mm-hmm. And then the other lens that we took was these principles in the book, strategic leadership. What are the highest performing nonprofits working on the ground that we think are best equipped to receive our funds and make an impact in global poverty? So that's sort of how we.
Yeah, and so I would say Kim and I both share that bit more micro view. I'm not familiar with the second set of goals that you were talking about. I'm familiar with the Millennial Development Goals. And so listen, how can you disagree with the United Nations and Davos and the School of Philanthropy, having a set of goals that they all pay attention to? It's a measurement problem too. So the largest force for poverty alleviation in the history of mankind is capitalism in China.
Economic growth, yeah, China.
Right? The second, capitalism in India.
India.
And so, when we hit that, the predictions are we're going to eliminate extreme poverty within 20 years. Will that be because of the United Nations, because of King Philanthropies, or will it because of more macro forces? And so, I'm not sure I have a thoughtful answer. Do these large top-down goals motivate and make a difference? It's less clear to me.
Yeah.
You talked about Give Directly having direct impact. Well, Give Directly actually has a second mission, which is to pioneer the movement. So the biggest impact Give Directly is having over time is working with governments and aid organizations to take different interventions, sometimes cash, and actually get it delivered to the people.
Right.
And so that's the billions of dollars that they're going to influence. And it's also the best tool yet to, reduce corruption.
Yeah, right.
Below
because there isn't
1%.
an intermediate chain.
There's
Money
no
goes
intermediate.
directly.
You're getting it over your cell phone.
Angela?
I'm Angela Hay. I'm on the board of a couple of small nonprofits. The Packard Foundation produced a report which showed that there was a lot of money in Silicon Valley, but there are also a lot of nonprofits here, and there's a gap between small nonprofits and the people who can give the money. Do you see this, and what can one do about this?
You could try me one more time. There's a lot of small nonprofits.
There's a lot of small nonprofits. There are
In
a
the
lot
Bay
of
Area,
bigger
the
donors,
huge
but
number
they're
of-
not giving to the small nonprofits, I think Angela's saying.
Yeah, the nonprofits have boards who may be, I don't know, they may be in medical and they may be full of nurses and they don't know anybody at Facebook or something like this?
Well, so you're on an issue, not so much on small nonprofits, but on human services nonprofits.
Right.
So in the fundraising chapter, we talk about PIPs, Partners in Pluto Philanthropy, universities, academic medical centers, museums, high-end cultural. They all have major donor functions. Development professionals meet with major donors. We think there's a huge opportunity for that function in different ways to be brought to social services, human needs, as well as, the Partners in Pluto Philanthropy. And so 2 examples. You probably know about Robert Hood Foundation. Basically, if you're a cool hedge fund person in New York, you go to Robin Hood and you give them a lot of money. They've raised $1.5 billion for U.S. Poverty alleviation nonprofit. And we have one in San Francisco called Tipping Point, which is similar. And so the small one, you've got the scale problem, and most people won't do this. You got to hire a development professional, and you got to wait the 18 to 24 months for them to cover their cost. Major donors is different, and if you have a board that's filled with people who don't have that network, it's probably just not going to start.
Unless there's an intermediate like Robinhood or something that is going to support. I mean, Robinhood does support a lot of smaller foundations or a lot of smaller nonprofits.
The other thing that everybody understands about major donors is they are inundated.
They are inundated with requests. Inundated with requests. So they build a wall. They build a wall typically to keep.
And all the leverage is in actually getting to have a substantive discussion with one of them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let's go over here.
Hello, my name's Stephanie. I'm from Epic Foundation. My first question was actually very similar. I was thinking, who defines impact? And then how do we connect high-level impact nonprofit organizations with more savvy philanthropists? And so I guess building on from that, have you seen technology being used so that some of the data that demonstrates high impact is accessible to potential donors?
So we say in the book, and I think it's still true, there's no sector of the U.S. economy that has been less touched by technology than the nonprofit sector. Even in fundraising, people argue about this, but the Stanford Development Group raises more money in a year for nonprofits, a nonprofit, than the internet does. And the most amazing thing is I've been following internet philanthropy from the first day of the internet. And meanwhile, Kickstarter and this phenomena, has raised tens of billions?
A phenomenal amount of money.
A phenomenal amount of money with no tax deduction and in exchange for getting something.
And now we
in the
have
mail.
initial coin offerings in addition, Bill.
And the cost of fundraising face to face, it's just getting more expensive.
Yeah.
Even more so, let's take Give Directly as, to me, a great example. The service delivery for nonprofits has been largely untouched by technology as well. I mean, even the things we've seen, like universities and online learning, well, we're 10 years into that?
Yeah, probably 15 even.
15, and the first 3 or 4 years it was going to change everything, and then
it's having some change.
And so that the point is, we need that in a lot of different nonprofit areas, which is posing the question, how can we apply technology in a way that has the same or greater impact at a lower cost? I'll give you one of my favorite examples. John's familiar with it. It's called Care Message. Started by Vineet Singh Gal, one of these incredible Stanford undergraduates. He's probably 5 years out. I happen to have a chronic disease. I have a concierge nurse. 95% of my interactions are emailing Sharon and saying I feel shitty today. She sends back and she says, well, that's fine, but it'll be better tomorrow. Well, they do this for Care Message. So for diabetes, for a range of chronic illnesses, for obesity, they have texting which has been shown to not only increase the sense of well-being from the patient, but it's beginning to be evidence in things like diabetes that they can affect outcomes. That is cutting edge for service delivery in the nonprofit sector, and I think there are many other areas could use it, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, let's go over here.
Thank you. My name is Lisa Patrides, and I'm CEO and founder of a nonprofit called the Institute for the Study of Knowledge Management and Education. And we apply
For college,
knowledge management
Knowledge
and education. And we
education.
apply principles of open access to democratize access to education, to transform teaching and learning. We're 15 years old, and this question has to do with scale. And I guess I have to take the quiz on your site to see if we're in the scale jail quadrant or not. But for
Please
about
do.
the last 8 years or so, we've been at the $2 million mark. And about 4 years ago, we had a big strategic planning year with our board where we really went full on to develop a sustainability model for the organization. It was very hard. That's probably a book at some point. And here we are now 4 years into that. And 4 years ago, we were still about 90% funded by philanthropic donations and 10% services and other things. And today we're 50-50. So we met our goal, which we should be just celebrating, but we've been unable to actually, break that sort of get past that $2 million mark. We thought this was not only about sustainability, but it would be about scale. So we've just this year sort of been seeding some ideas of growth capital and a capital campaign, and just sort of meeting people and talking about it. And what not everybody, but all of the high net worth donors I've come and talked to here in the Valley basically say, well, ed tech is a hot thing right now in education. You really ought to spin that off and make a for-profit. And almost to a T, talking about the mission-driven piece of what we do, and they say, oh, that's not important. You can still be a B Corp, and you can still do good things. And it's been, I want to read what you've said about this, because some of my answers may be in there. But I know some other people who are sort of in that same kind of situation, and maybe it's because we're so Silicon Valley based, and that's part of the problem. But we want to show that a nonprofit can be mission based and can make this kind of difference, but we're not seeing the support for that.
So many really interesting issues in there. Where do we start?
Yeah.
Silicon Valley, younger philanthropists. John and I were talking earlier. We're talking about all these millennial billionaires that are changing the world of philanthropy. Well, actually, most of them haven't given much money yet, and there's no relevant history of 30 or young 40-year-old people giving away large amounts of money. People give away money mostly when they begin to encounter some sense of legacy and mortality. And so my first question is whether you're calling on the right people. The second thing, which we can't answer here, but is your business model, right? Maybe your business model maxes out at 50% earned revenue, right? It's hard to tell. One of the things you find around on campus, in the new world, which is people like to think they pick their business model. Well, mostly, if you have an 80% gross margin, it's probably a business. And if you lose money in everything you do, it's probably a nonprofit. And there's some ranges in between. And so I guess my one swing thought for you is you need one high net worth individual to give you $1 million matching gift over 5 years.
Yeah.
Something like that. And you've referred to growth capital plans, which I thought was a terrific idea, and they've kind of seeded into the ether. But the growth capital plan was a simple idea, very prevalent about 10 years ago. You give us a 5-year strategic plan with 5 years of numbers, and the funders will give you 5 years of money. Made perfect sense, but there weren't enough.
Didn't take.
Didn't take for some reason.
Yeah.
And one other thing I would add is on the fundraising and development, you often have to spend money in order to raise money, whether that's hiring development professionals or not.
Yeah.
And most organizations that just can't get past that threshold, if they look at their staff and their team on development, they're underspending there. And so there is a return, it just takes a while.
Just takes a while, right.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Bagumbrani Jerice. I'm a medical student from the University of Arizona, starting a residency in...
ASU, right here.
All right. Starting a residency in family medicine next year, and my interest in philanthropy is primarily in nonprofit healthcare sector and in county and community medical care. So I was sort of hoping that you would speak to what your experience was at the very other side of your whole journey in philanthropy and in nonprofit work, and that is how to develop a team and create those first steps moving in a direction that has a mission that's clear and focused, like you said.
You mean forming, for example, a nonprofit that does community health care, and how do you put the team together?
And picking a team and creating relationships that keep the trajectory of the nonprofit true to its mission.
Oh, very hard. I mean, many of you, John, you'll know, just typically, venture-backed business startups, the first 3 to 5 years can be very unstable.
Yeah.
And in
well,
fact,
and
the
lots
base
of
case,
startups end up changing because they have to respond to market pressures, right? What do you do with a nonprofit?
Right,
And it's got
exactly.
a mission, right? And there are lots of pressures to take that.
and so and let's use a community medical clinic. You have some young doctors, nurses, other professionals, and they're in their 30s.
Yeah.
Say, well, the list of things that might take them away from that dedication is long and predictable. And so I'm not sure what the secret sauce is, really. In most cases like that, there is a Chris Bischoff or a Roy Prostman or somebody this is going to be their life's work, and they're going to continue to reformulate the team until the team sticks.
Or you
But I would think
fuse a different economic model. I mean, the community health clinic run by the medical school fuses some paid staff with most of the docs and residents are volunteers. And that's the only way it works. And some people pay small amounts of money.
For sure.
And it all works. But it depends on philanthropy. You pull out the philanthropic dollars, it dies. So I think Kim's standing up, meaning we're running out of time. And let me just close by saying congratulations on writing a really terrific book at a really important time.
Thank you, John.
And thank you
Very
for being
honored
here
to be
this
here.
evening. Kim.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.